Good Monday afternoon from the deck. State of emergency in St. Louis County, Missouri. The county executive just issued it, with protesters back on the streets after a bloody night. A look outside the federal courthouse in St. Louis from a few minutes ago. A couple of hundred demonstrators are there for what they're calling Moral Monday. About a half hour ago, our team watched as police made a couple of arrests after demonstrators crossed a police line. We'll keep a close eye on this with live pictures throughout the hour, and we'll let you know. Things in Ferguson were mostly peaceful last night until people who police say were not part of the demonstrations started shooting. Protesters and camera crews running for cover after hearing what sounded like gunfire. We have more images in our slideshow for you this afternoon. Police say that man opened fire on a series of officers, or I should say a group of officers really, and that they fired back, wounded him critically. He's 18 years old and charged with assault, and this is the suspect, we're told, on the ground from last night. The suspect's father is calling the police version of what happened, quote, a bunch of lies, unquote. That shooting happened shortly after what police are calling a remarkable amount of gunfire between two groups in a separate incident. But again, police have been careful to say that those doing the shooting are not part of the protests, and that Ferguson has come too far since last year to allow people like that to change things.
There's too many people that have worked too hard, and I'm not talking about the police department. I'm talking about people in our community. They worked too hard for this to happen and be undermined.
Up until last night, things in Ferguson had been pretty quiet, really. There were peaceful marches earlier in the day, including this one that Michael Brown's father taking part in, and that's this one here in our slideshow for you this afternoon. The one that Michael Brown's father is taking a part in. A very different scene later on. For the first time in days of protest, some officers were dressed in riot gear, which was surprising to all those concerned. Demonstrators set vehicles on fire. Witnesses say one person threw a bottle at the cops but missed. Police at one point tried using smoke to break up the crowds. And here you can see a protester holding up a flare in the rain. There were some windows broken around town. That's a cash register in the wet street there. Police say they did make a few arrests. And here you'll be able to see officers back behind a police cruiser. They say one officer ended up with a few cuts after getting hit with a rock to his face. You don't see that here. Officials say protesters also pepper sprayed two other officers. Joining us now is Jim Salter. He's a reporter for the Associated Press. Says he was half a block away when he heard the gunshots last night. He's also the author of this book, Deadly Force, Fatal Confrontations with Police. It's nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shepard. Great to be with you.
What happened last night?
You know, it was a night that was kind of touchy from the get-go. Heavy rain passed through the area, and as soon as it cleared, things started to get pretty shaky. There was a confrontation between police and protesters that was pretty rowdy. You mentioned a couple of the incidents, but one officer was hit in the face with a rock, in addition to the pepper spray incidents. And then all of a sudden, gunshots rang out. And that's when we all ducked for cover.
Jim, police are saying that the person or maybe persons involved with this shooting were not part of the demonstrations. What do they mean by that, according to your reporting?
Well, these demonstrations have generally drawn about 90 to 95% of the people who are there for a good cause. But there are always a few people who show up just to cause trouble. The people who were causing the trouble last night were not demonstrating. They were not showing support for Michael Brown. They were, for the most part, in the background, breaking into buildings. And the chief is making a point to make it clear that there are people there for a good cause and there are people there to cause trouble.
And they're able to figure out who's who by what?
Well, that's the hard part. You don't. When you've got thousands of people, in some cases from last August and November, and the case from last night, several hundred people, you can't. And the police, they do their best, but the people are intermingling, so it's really difficult to say who's there for what reason.
Jim Salter, reporter for the Associated Press. What's going on there today? This state of emergency now for the county. Give us the details as you know them.
The state of emergency actually, as I understand it, is just for Ferguson and the area directly around Ferguson. And what that means is it gives the county police chief, John Belmar, more options to take control of the situation, as opposed to Ferguson police being in control of the situation.
And the move at the courthouse today in St. Louis, it's my understanding that some demonstrators crossed a police line of sorts. What can you report?
They've been planning a day of civil unrest for actually a couple of weeks. This was not in response to the shooting last night. This is something that's been planned to mark the anniversary of Michael Brown's death. But about 50 people ended up being arrested after marching to the courthouse and crossing a line and blocking the entrance. Some of those people were clergy. This was actually a very peaceful protest, and it had been planned for some time.
Jim, before we go, we've been talking about a few blocks in Ferguson, Missouri, and around the federal courthouse, or I should say the courthouse there in St. Louis. Bigger picture in and around St. Louis and suburbs, what is the attitude now? Has anything changed?
You know, I think it's pretty fluid right now. I think everybody was expecting a kind of a peaceful weekend, and the event last night caught everyone off guard. So that's kind of one of the things we're looking for right now. How are people going to react to what happened last night? Right now it's been a bit of a mixed reaction, with some people thinking police overstepped their boundaries and others thinking that police were absolutely justified in what they did.
Jim Salter from Associated Press. Jim, thank you.
Thanks, Shep.
I mentioned organizers were calling for this to be a day of civil disobedience, but they did not give many details, really. Trace Gallagher with some details as we have them. What do you expect from the protesters today? What are we led to believe?
Yeah, that's the problem, Shep. So far, nobody has ordered or offered any real specifics except to say they plan to bring attention to police violence against minorities. The peaceful protest that's underway right now, you're talking about in St. Louis, there have been some arrests for crossing barriers and the like, and we are expecting more people to begin gathering in Ferguson as the day goes on. Even residents in St. Louis County are unclear about what to expect. One man likened it to a hurricane heading to your city, but he said you don't know if it's going to be a Category 1 or a Category 5. Police in Ferguson and St. Louis County say they are planning on disruptions throughout the day and night, but nothing on the scale of when the grand jury decided not to indict Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting of Michael Brown. Missouri Governor Jay Nixon has also released a statement calling for peaceful protests so the region can continue moving in what he calls a positive direction, Shep. But they are bracing, and it's all hands on deck throughout the day.
Are we getting anything from protesters about the shooting last night?
Well, their biggest concern so far seems to be about the fact that the shooting involved plainclothes police officers who were not wearing body cameras. Now, remember, there's been this major push to make sure that every single officer is equipped with both audio and video. The Organization for Black Struggle released a statement saying, and I'm quoting here, after a year of protests and conversations about police accountability, having plainclothes officers without body cameras leaves us with only the officer's account of the incident, which is clearly a problem. So while the family of the shooting victim, they're saying they believe the police shooting was unjustified, the various protest groups in and around Ferguson and St. Louis County are, at least for now, focusing on police policy in the early going. Shep.
Trace Gallagher, thank you. A statement from the county executive out. He says, among other things, my authority as county executive to issue a state of emergency effective immediately. The recent acts of violence will not be tolerated in a community that has worked so tirelessly over the last year to rebuild and become stronger. The county executive in St. Louis County, Missouri. State of emergency now for Ferguson and surrounding areas. Updates from there and the city of St. Louis as we have them throughout.